It's great to be here. And so, yes, we're going to start off our first session with the YOPD Working Group. And we have a presentation which is led by a co-chair, Gaynor Edwards. So I'm going to pass over to Gaynor to talk through what we've been doing on the working group, some of our aims, ambitions, and our roadmap for taking this forward. Over to you, Gaynor.
Okay, hello everyone. We are delighted and a tiny bit anxious, and I'm actually going to upgrade that tiny bit anxious as pretty anxious to be the first act to hit the stage at this virtual leadership forum. As was said, is the largest working group. We've got 25 members representing partner organisations from all over the globe. Of those 25, 16 received a diagnosis of YOPD under the age of 50. That includes myself, Sonia, John and Christy, all up on stage today. All those invited to join our working group jumped at the chance, unless of course they were off. Others tracked us down to offer their help, keen to be part of this fresh approach. There is a wealth of knowledge within our group, but perhaps greater still is the personal experience of the condition that many of us carry. This YOP group really does possess the inside story on YOPD and potentially perhaps the key to better therapies in future. The group dynamic across patients, clinicians and researcher, one of mutual respect and a shared mindset, conveys not just hope but confidence that we can make a lasting difference. We'd like to convey our heartfelt thanks to all these brilliant minds and a speedy recovery to co-chair Russell, watching from his sickbed, and Ben, whose brilliant brain is waiting for contents to settle post-DBS.
Y is for young onset Parkinson's disease, YOPD.
Well, that was a slightly less shaky start than predicted. Sonia, would you like to take it over from here?
Sure, Gaynor, thank you. So a logical question comes to mind when we talk about this. What exactly are we calling YOPD? This question is not so easy to answer. A look at the literature will find some papers putting the cutoff age at 40, some 45, 50, or even 60, depending on where you are globally. But what matters is that this type of Parkinson's seems to be different. Although the cause of this disease is likely multifactorial, for YOPD, genetics may play a more significant role. We, as a working group, have drawn the line at diagnosis under 50 as the measure that we will use. But onset is, of course, the key word here because many people wait sometimes 5 to 10 years to be diagnosed and sometimes longer still. This YOPD cutoff is simply being used until we come up with a globally accepted definition or we find a better way to categorize the spectrum of disease. And that categorization may indeed be accomplished in part through using complete genome sequencing. We expect to be able to identify many more genetic types of YOPD beyond recognizing the handful of people that tend to get checked for currently. Further, phenotypically and importantly, genotypically classifying PD will ultimately focus research efforts which can lead to better treatments, something that we've all been waiting for.
So genetics has given us something solid to go on. But why is this working group focusing on YOPD exclusively? To date, young onset Parkinson's disease has not been well described epidemiologically or clinically, with the exception of a paper by Bart Post, who happily is one of our working group members. This largely untapped community of YOPDers has the energy and the motivation to get involved. YOPD has potentially, those who are living with young onset Parkinson's disease potentially have 30 to 40 years or more of living with the condition, providing the potential for long-term research. The community, this community is driven, it's interested, it's also tech savvy, and likely to be a focused and very powerful force for progress. Young onset Parkinson's disease is, this group is diverse yet easily identified, which can be ring-fenced for research. YOPD has a really great appeal for media because of the novelty of this condition. Back to Gaynor.
Thanks, Polly. So there are many factors, reasons why we should be looking at young onset, and to address the very good reasons why that is, the non-diagnosis, the misdiagnosis. Wrong treatment can lead obviously to frustration and anxiety, and this stretches far beyond the individuals, but also to the family, to the community, with an impact on economy and society as a whole. We need this multidisciplinary care plan in place, and I think what is required, what the problems are, will come out of the research that we're doing. With limited treatments available, obviously, it's so much more important that there's a greater understanding of the management of the medication. So Parkinson's is considered the most complex neurological condition, but sadly it's not all down to genetics, but genes do at least give us a factual starting point. And the greater the likelihood of genetic types, many yet to be discovered within the far smaller YOPD community, is a new approach. Potentially this could pave the way for better treatments to the PD community as a whole. We have a global YOPD patient engagement through the World Parkinson's Coalition and with their endorsement. And we're asking select researchers and organisations across the globe to work with us in genetically testing YOPD and sharing genome information. This will provide some vital new information, especially across the differing ethnicities. While this is the whole genome, it's not, however, the whole story. And any way that we are able to identify common groups with YOPD, the better. At this point, I'd like to pass over to John.
Running in tandem with this, we, again, through the WPC, we're interested in producing a YOPD global survey. This, we believe, is going to be the first of its kind. It's created by patient researchers, i.e. those who are with YOPD, but also for YOPD patients. So we anticipate it being the most thorough survey of its type with YOPD as the subject matter. There is the potential for participants to revisit and update, perhaps 5 years later into their disease progression. By virtue of participants having been diagnosed under the age of 50, we should in most cases be able to get a longer term view of the disease progression and perhaps more importantly, common symptoms, side effects to medication, and perhaps factors little considered by the scientific community to date. Latest thinking on Parkinson's, for instance, believes that it's a combination of factors with genetic, environment, and some kind of trigger factor, whether that be emotional or physical trauma.
I'd like to go back to some of the comments and questions that were posted on the platform. One being around sort of the criteria and definition of YOPD. The question is what we call YOPD actively a separate variant of Parkinson's impacting people regardless of age? And I know Gaynor and John, you know, that we had some discussions around the criteria. So in the Northern Hemisphere, it's anyone under the age of 50. But in Australia, for example, it's under 60. Did you want to say anything about this, Gaynor, John, Sonia?
I think, as we've said before, that really at the moment it's just a way of us ring fencing this group. People can wait years to get a diagnosis. So the age that we're using, 50 cutoff point, is their age at diagnosis, being under 50. But it could be that their onset, I mean, there are some people in the group that had the condition 30 years prior to their diagnosis. So for the moment, it's just a case of us ring fencing this group of younger people with Parkinson's as a group of people with a syndrome, so that we can drill down and find more specific information. And hopefully genetics will be the route where we have that definitive bit of information, and that will allow us to be more specific in groups, because it will be a rare disease ultimately, probably, with many cases.
I think it's also worth saying that we're going to be guided really by the consensus of the literature, whereas some individuals would classify it as being a diagnosis before 40 even, and some, that's at one level. And at the other extreme, in the Antipodes, it's up to 60, which I think is another quite extreme value. We picked 50 on the grounds that seems to be the main sort of consensus value, and I think it's just easier to work with, to be honest.
Thank you. Another, I guess it's more of a comment really, but someone's sort of just written here about perhaps we should consider dropping the YOPD acronym. Acronyms are an enemy of understanding engagement with wide audiences. So maybe that's something that we can discuss in the working group. So another question coming in: how will you access the survey to collect the data from the global community, and not just North American and the European community? So,
do you want to take that, John?
So I didn't quite catch it.
So how are we going to ensure that people can access the survey and collect data from people sort of globally, not just the North American and European community?
I think that's the crux of the entire survey in a nutshell. I think one of the things that we are going to critically have to do is make sure that we can get data. As you say, we don't. It's not that we don't want the North American, European access. We certainly do, but we also want it to reflect a much wider world. There'll be some areas, without question, that it'll be very difficult to access. Some of the former Soviet countries, I think, are quite restrictive in terms of data. The intention is particularly that we're going to try and get this survey written into a range of languages. And obviously, if you have something that is in your own language, it's much more accessible than simply in English. So we will start in English simply because that's the logical place for us to do so. But the intention is to try and get it into a multiplicity of languages as quickly as possible. And I think that'll go a long way towards getting it accepted in terms of and accessed. It's going to be done remotely as well, using RedCap as going to be the format.
Thank you, John. I think we've got, before we go on to our brainstorm session, which will look a little bit more about how we're going to disseminate the survey and collect data. Just one more question here. Is there any evidence that there is a genetic cause connection in all people with YOPD?
I think there's evidence that it's not necessarily the main factor in all cases, but it's well known that there is a larger genetic component in young onset cases. And obviously, the younger you go, if you're going around to 30 or whatever, something like that as the time of onset, then there's certainly a genetic link there. I suspect that the argument is that it's diminished as you go higher up the age range, but certainly from 50 downwards as an age of onset, we would anticipate there being clearer evidence for genetic involvement. I think that's generally fairly widely accepted these days.
I read out a little piece from Ending Parkinson's in the video, actually, Fee, which explained that more likelihood of them being genetic causes, and that gives us something for the researchers to actually work with. It gives us that opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We've got lots of questions coming in now. We'll try and answer a couple more, but it's something that we'll look at all the questions off afterwards and come back to you all. But another one here: is there any other factor besides your age that you would define that would help you define that you have diagnosis of YOPD?
See, YOPD is not, even though it's called young onset Parkinson's disease, it's a syndrome. So, as I say, it's just a way of ring fencing a group of people so that we can drill down and find more specific information. You know, ultimately the aim is that the condition won't be called YOPD. You will come under the YOPD umbrella. The condition will be LARC, pink, or whatever, you know, some yet to be discovered genetic versions that impact on young people with Parkinson's.
And finally here, how much research is currently available on the trigger factors for YOPD?
Not enough.
I think there's plenty that's available, but it's speculative. There's nothing really definitive beyond things like drinking well water, agricultural pesticides, this kind of thing. I mean, those are links are reasonably well established, but I think what we're looking to do in the survey is look at some of the more subtle links, perhaps.
Okay, so I think I'm just looking at the time. So we've obviously got to, as a group, we've defined and looked at, and want to look at today, 2 areas for our brainstorming session. And the first is related to the Promise survey. So I'm going to hand over for the next 10-15 minutes over to John and Matt and Sonia, who are just going to talk a little bit about the survey and some of the questions we'd like to put out to you all and get sort of feedback on. We have 1 or 2 questions that were posted earlier on the platform, so I'll also add the questions that come in, but keep sending in your questions. Over to you, John and Matt.
If I can just take it from the top, the first thing to say, and in response to everyone's unanswered questions, why another survey? Do we really need another survey? Yes, we do. We very definitely need another survey. This is going to be an entirely different beast from all those previously done, for a number of reasons. Firstly, we anticipate it being done on a scale that's not previously been used. So we're hoping, and you can quote this back to me if it goes wrong, but we're hoping to get in excess of 1,000 participants in the trial if we can, in the study, survey if we can. These also will be from a wider range of countries than previously done, but the key distinction that makes it very different from all other surveys is that this is a survey designed by people with young onset Parkinson's disease. It's designed for them, and it will frame the kind of questions that are of interest to them. We all know that there are plenty of surveys out there generated by neurologists, by medical professionals, and these represent a patient voice, but a patient voice that's been transduced through a second voice. So it's one that's obviously distorted by the preferences of the people asking. We believe that if you have YOPD people actually writing the survey and circulating the survey, that will be the area which makes the biggest difference, because the way we talk to each other as fellow sufferers with Parkinson's is very different from the way we talk to medical professionals. To give you a trivial example, the proportion of people with Parkinson's who exhibit hallucinations when reported to medical professionals is perhaps only 5%, 10%, something of that order. When patients talk amongst themselves, it's a great deal higher. Same goes for impulse control disorders. So this is the key thing. Some of the data which is distorted in medical professional-led studies is not going to be distorted in this. So that's just a brief summary of our key rationale for having the survey. Does anyone do we have any questions, Fiona, you want to throw out at this point, or?
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on this already, sort of the fact that we want to, get as many people in as many countries involved and participate in the survey. I think one of the questions coming in was, do we have a plan to distribute this globally? How can people help with this distribution and getting it out and promoting the survey?
Well, I think that's why we need the partners' help that are gathered here today. I think that we need to use sort of a global, we have to approach this globally. This is a global problem, it's a global disease. This information will help the whole community. So by having it disseminated through different organizations and their reach, that would be very helpful to us. There's also some Parkinson's advocate organizations like PD Avengers that could also help, and the larger and smaller organizations, because we want this to be global reach. As John was saying earlier, this is a global survey and it requires the voices of everyone. And that includes, as we discussed, people that speak a different language, have a different life experience.
Thank you, Sonia. And I guess this might come back to you again, sorry, John. But this question around sort of numbers, do you have a critical mass that you want to reach before you can start generating results from this survey?
It's a very good question, an entirely valid one. It's one that has been exercising my mind considerably on this. I think we would like to get to a minimum of 500 responses, complete responses, before we would feel comfortable applying anything serious in terms of statistics on it. We'd like to get it to over 1,000, and I don't think that's unreasonable. If we can get beyond there, then so much the better. But the other thing that's worth pointing out with this survey is that it's a dynamic survey, in the sense that we will issue for the public usage an iteration of the survey at one time point, and then at, say, 6 months later on, we'll be able to issue an updated version of the survey, which will contain people's revised thoughts. I mean, as the condition develops, we want to be able to reflect that, so that people will be able to look at their own data and see how it's changed with time. But also that data will provide insights to the scientific community as well.
So not to put you on the spot, John, but do you have a sort of time frame in mind for the survey? Is there anything you can share at this point in terms of perhaps when you'd like it to be launched? Obviously, it's a very ambitious project, but do you have any key dates in mind for launching this?
I wouldn't say we're working to a key date. I think, as I've said previously about the survey, we're going to work to a key quality. It's very much quality driven rather than time driven. I'd rather, as I've been quoted on a couple of points, I'd rather that we get it right first time rather than rush to a particular deadline. That said, I would anticipate that we would have certainly the first possibly 2 different versions of it ready to go towards the latter part of autumn, or fall, I think, as you call it on your side of the Atlantic.
Great. Can't any more questions coming in regarding the survey? Perhaps we'll move over to our second subgroup, which is women in YOPD, and we have Christy and Polly on the stage, who's just going to provide a little bit of a summary and perhaps a question, and what we'd like some input from everyone.
Good morning, everybody. Good day, everybody. So to start off, I just want to provide some background. So in the women's community, and most of this tends to be if you're talking to other women who have YOPD, or on social media, you see this question a lot. There's evidence that YOPD symptoms, both unfortunately motor and non-motor, are affected and possibly even exacerbated with hormonal fluctuations that are associated with menstrual cycles. And oftentimes folks will report that their PD medications seem to be absolutely ineffective during their menstrual cycle. This is really poorly addressed and often not recognized, even among care teams. So as a scientist, I've started to go through the scientific literature, and I found that in my preliminary data, only 5% of YOPD papers actually mention menstruation, and only about 23% of the papers in the scientific literature mention women at all. So how as a community do we begin to address these issues that are specific to women, as we know that there is a pretty reasonable percentage of women that do have YOPD? So how do we begin to address these issues that are specific to women? That we'd like the input of other groups that are also working on this, because we know that this is a problem that lots of different groups that are aligned with women's issues are working on. So how as a community do we begin to address these issues specific to women? So everyone's input would be much appreciated.
We certainly know, even within our own group, don't we, Christy, that there's finally a very keen awareness that the young onset women have been, they kind of slipped through the net, and it needs to be addressed. And everyone seems to, we're reaching a point where there's enthusiasm about it. So it may well be that that's the first section of the survey that we bring out as well.
So not only questions, but a lot of support from what you're saying, and for the survey. People are saying that they would like to help and get involved. So that's brilliant. Thank you.
So the medication issue we can talk about. So how can pharma help better address the needs of women is a good question that we could be talking about. Okay, so if we look at research and clinical trials, women actually weren't in the US weren't involved in clinical trials until about 1993, after FDA rules were rescinded from 1977. So any research recently on clinical trials involving PD medications, they have been including women. But unfortunately, if you look at the ages in these clinical trials, it's all women who are past 60. And they're not addressing any questions that are specific to hormonal cycles and hormonal fluctuations. So unfortunately, women are being included in this, but they're not being asked stuff based on age.
And they need to be.
Thank you.
Right. It needs to be split out by age because there are differences. So for this, we'd like to kind of present some action items that we think that we can start on right away as we're trying to develop a plan for how to proceed with this. So how we can begin to address these questions to women about women. So we have these action items. So there are two goals. So we would like to ask care teams to begin to ask following questions that are part of routine visits. And we'd also like YOPD women, we'd encourage and want to empower you to discuss these things with your care team as well. So for care teams, we'd like to ask that you start to begin to ask YOPD women, how are your hormone fluctuations affecting your PD symptoms? So we can start to gather data on this, okay? Are you tracking your PD symptoms and menstrual cycles? There's lots of apps that this can be tracked with. And possibly if we can get enough traction, things can be added to existing apps, possibly, hopefully, that can track more of these PD symptoms. So like rigidity, issues with gait, tremor, that correspond to cycles. And to ask, how have your menstrual cycles changed since we last met? Because some people, for anecdotal evidence, it's possible there are some changes in cycle, some changes in flow. Okay. So, and PD treatments being affected by menstrual cycle. So again, anecdotal evidence is that carbidopa levodopa seems to be absolutely ineffective for a few days leading up to a cycle to a few days through the start of a cycle. So for women, we'd encourage you to discuss with your care teams how your cycle impacts your PD symptoms and how it's changed and how your cycle affects the efficacy of your medication. We don't think that these things are being talked about enough. And a lot of women feel, from anecdotal evidence again, that they're just not being heard on this and that their care teams don't understand this is actually an issue. So that doesn't feel very good being a YOPD woman when your issues aren't being heard.
Thanks, Christy.
Yeah.
John.
I think it's interesting. I'm just fascinated by the science of it. And one of the things that strikes me is it would be very, very interesting to know, and we could probably get that information from the survey, is whether they get a differential effect of agonists or of levodopa, whether they find preferentially that levodopa is ineffective and that the agonists are effective, or vice versa, or any combination of the two, because that will tell us a great deal about where the changes are, whether they're pre or post synaptic, for instance.
That anecdotally, it might be both.
I mean, I have no theory on that. I'm just fascinated by the observation or where it might lead.
Yeah, it would definitely be interesting to correlate what medications folks are taking and how active it seems to be or how effective it seems to be during their cycle.
I think it might
Very
also
exciting.
be interesting to look at during pregnancy as well. I mean, if one has that access to that kind of information.
Interestingly enough, from my preliminary data, if you actually look through, and so the way that I've been approaching this is looking under PubMed and just young onset Parkinson's. There's like 700 and something papers that come up. And my goal is with my students to go through every single one of those papers to figure out and quantify age of onset listed in the papers, which again is all over the place, whether women are mentioned, menstruation, and pregnancy. Pregnancy is actually mentioned in about 15% of the papers so far, whereas menstruation is only mentioned in about 5%.
Well, I know, for instance, in the third trimester of pregnancy, for instance, if I remember correctly, the progesterone levels go through the roof. Mm-hmm. And so that's certainly associated with changes in dopamine reuptake.
Okay. Thank you. So we have a question coming in here to Christy. Are you thinking of also considering other factors outside the health factors for women, i.e. lifestyle, family, work, and so on?
So I think that will that be, I believe that some of that will be included in the survey. So we can, when we get the survey data, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that since it's very comprehensive, that we can look at all those things to see, are symptoms exacerbated if you're in a stressful, like if you're working full time, or if you have kids, so on and so on.
Right.
The plan is it'll include practically every demographic you could ever think of, and probably more.
I think with the survey, it's a case that we need to divvy it up so that it's in bite-sized pieces, really, isn't it? And lead it in from a topic, whether that's through webinars or podcasts or whatever, and spread it out there as an ongoing thing. Do you like that?
So we've got some great, it's got fantastic, so there's lots of comments and people, positive feedback here regarding the survey and the women's group, and a lot of people saying they want to help distribute and help promote the survey, which is brilliant. So another question, so will this be a longitudinal survey, John?
Yep, next question.
How many women include OBGYN in their care team and ever discuss PD with that physician?
I think that that's an unknown. Also, just from anecdotal evidence, that a lot of times OBGYNs they're just a normal OBGYN isn't as well versed in PD as we would like. So I think that the goal of this working group and our actions going forward is to be able to distribute information and to all portions of a care team.
Can we quickly name check our secret weapon there as well? Because we have Anna-Leanne also on the group, who is a gynecologist with young onset Parkinson's.
So Anna-Leanne is a great source of information for being a gynecologist and OBGYN in our group, who can really help with all these issues and how to approach it with the community.
Thank you.
I'm delighted we found one. I've been looking for one personally for 8 years.
So we've got questions coming in, sort of asking how they can help, how they can distribute. So I think we'll obviously work with the WPC in getting information out to everyone who's on this session today, a little bit more updates to everyone and how they can get involved. But it's great to see the enthusiasm there. Another one here, key to the questionnaire is the understanding persons with Parkinson's and impact on functioning in daily life and translating that to clinical and research items. Is that correctly understood?
Yes.
Good. And again, will the survey be distributed globally? So I think that's all the key thing here is making sure that we reach out to everyone across the world. Another one, have you considered how technology like apps can help with tracking symptoms on menstrual cycles? There are lots of apps that can help women track their period, and this could be added, it could be an added component. So Christy and Polly, I guess this is something you're talking about.
Yeah, we've talked about that. We've mentioned it a few times. So there's apps like Clue that maybe someone would want to develop a module that attaches onto Clue that you can track your PD symptoms. So just a nice simple app, a nice simple kind of component that whether or not you have, more dystonia, that you have more bradykinesia, that you are just, your gait is off, just these easy things to track in the app. That would be ideal to eventually get to that place, that we can collect the data from it to see what folks, to see the results of that.
There's also something as well as devices. There's something about we can collect samples from, this is as far as the whole piece is concerned. So that there's also samples that can be collected, barcoded, that can all dovetail into this project.
And how can individuals who have a genetic predisposition but not exhibiting symptoms, I don't have Parkinson's diagnosis, support this work? Is it possible to expand it to these people?
Once again, with feeling fee.
Well, yeah, I mean, if it's for me, absolutely. I think it'd be fascinating. I think part of the survey will have to be dedicated to be looking at the issues, but it's something that I think we should definitely encourage people who are asymptomatic, but who know that they have a genetic predisposition, a strong genetic predisposition to Parkinson's disease, to take part. I think it'd be very illuminating.
Yeah, and the information gleaned over a period of time will also guide them on best medication or best course of treatment, hopefully, as well.
Yeah.
Lots to be learned and benefited from this.
I think we've got time for a few more questions. Someone's asked here, and Christy, do oral contraceptives change the picture? Is this a question that should be asked in the survey?
I believe it's going to be asked in the survey. I think that there, again, some anecdotal evidence that contraceptives do make it more regular, that you don't have that dip in efficacy. But again, that's all anecdotal, so that will be great to have in the survey. There's really limited data on women and hormones in Parkinson's, from what I could find. So it's very, very limited, unfortunately. We need to change that.
I think a big chunk of that is sometimes that people feel embarrassed, and then that's all part of, you know, the Parkinson, young onset Parkinson's community not coming out and actually asking the questions and flagging up the problems. So it's down to us as well as the clinicians. They need to ask and we need to volunteer.
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that part of the problem is that they don't know the answer if the question's asked sometimes. I think the research isn't there, the evidence isn't there yet. So maybe that's part of the issue, is that we have to have the answers for those questions as well.
So this is more of a general question as we're finishing off here. Given that other working groups also have surveys in their plan of actions at the WPC Coalition, could the WPC globally distribute a series of surveys, translate them, and a platform that holds data generated from them could then be very, very powerful? So maybe that's more of a comment and something to discuss after today with the other working groups and the WPC, but it's an interesting thought really, and how we take this forward, because another comment is here, you know, this is really ambitious, brilliant, but how we fund this work. Is there any thoughts, John and Gaynor, on the funding of this?
Going to fund it. My desperate hope is that we run out of time before I can have to answer it.
Well, we're almost there, John.
It's going to be a real challenge, there's no question about that, but it'll be easier to fund if we can actually engage people with the idea behind it. Once we can satisfy people that this is a very good idea, then usually the money will follow that. The difficulty will be if we fail to persuade people of the value of the study.
And this is the brainstorming session, isn't it? So how can we fund it?
Yeah.
People, question to you.
Also occurs to me that one of the areas that folks could help with, if you're offering how can you help, is the translation of this survey. We know we can hit a number of languages pretty easily, but there are so many languages that we don't have easy access to, or individuals who can help. So if you have access to languages that we wouldn't be able to easily translate into, we'd love your help.
Great. So I think that perhaps is a good place to finish off with. I'm looking at the time, and I just want to say thank you to all, on behalf of Gaynor and Russell, who's not here today, unfortunately, but some really, really positive comments coming through. It sounds like we're doing something that people are very interested in and want. So Gaynor, over to you. Do you want to finish off for the next 2 minutes?
Oh, I'd love to. I just want to say to everyone, thank you so much for getting involved, for engaging in this, and for the enthusiasm that we've got within our group, which is fantastic. And if enthusiasm is contagious, you know, we would love the wider Parkinson's community. Please come, give us your suggestions. Give us your ideas. How can we get people to engage with this survey? Because, you know, we can't just give them boom. There's 500 pages. We'll see you in 8 hours. Thanks for coming. It needs to be something that's encourages them properly to take part.
Thank you, Gaynor, and a big thank you really to everyone on the stage today. Gaynor, Christy, John, Matt, Sonia and Polly, for everything, and for all your comments today, and for the presentation. So that concludes really the YOPD presentation for today. So I'd like to leave it there and just thank you everyone for joining us today.